The All Blacks vs. the Springboks, a rivalry for the ages. The rivalry between the New Zealand All Blacks and the South African Springboks is one of the most celebrated and storied in rugby history. This fierce competition stretches back nearly a century, with both teams representing the pinnacle of rugby powerhouses. Throughout the decades, their matches have been battles of skill, strategy, and sheer willpower, shaping not just their nations but the rugby world at large. Beginnings. The first test, 1921. The rivalry kicked off in 1921, when the All Blacks and Springboks first faced off in a historic three-test series. New Zealand hosted South Africa in a tour that ended in a 1-1 draw, with one match being tied. This early encounter laid the foundation for what would become a battle of rugby supremacy for the next 100 years. From the very beginning, the Springboks' power and physicality clashed with the All Blacks' agility and flair. The 1949 series, Springboks dominate. In 1949, when the All Blacks toured South Africa, they faced one of their most crushing defeats. The Springboks swept the All Blacks 4-0 in the series, establishing themselves as a dominant force in world rugby. This series is often remembered for the Springboks' relentless forward play, which outmatched New Zealand's usually dynamic backline. The 1956 series, All Blacks Revenge. New Zealand finally got its revenge in 1956 when the Springboks toured New Zealand. This series was monumental, as the All Blacks beat South Africa in a test series for the first time. In front of raucous home crowds, New Zealand's forward pack, led by the great Kevin Skinner, managed to overpower the traditionally strong Springbok forwards. The victory was seen as a watershed moment in New Zealand rugby history, as they ended South Africa's dominance and asserted themselves as world champions. The apartheid years, political tension, and rugby. The 1960s to the 1980s was a complicated era for the rivalry due to South Africa's apartheid policies. The All Blacks played the Springboks sporadically during this time, but the series were often overshadowed by political tension. The 1981 tour of New Zealand by the Springboks was marked by protests and unrest, as many opposed the All Blacks playing a team from apartheid-era South Africa. The infamous flower bomb test saw planes flying over the stadium, dropping flower bombs to protest the match. Despite these disruptions, the rugby on the field remained intense, but it highlighted how much politics had intertwined with sport during this period. 1992. Rebirth of the rivalry. When apartheid ended, South Africa returned to the international rugby scene, and the Springboks' first match back was against the All Blacks in 1992. This match was symbolic as much as it was competitive. The Springboks were back, and the rivalry was reignited. Although South Africa was still finding its feet, the All Blacks won the match 27-24. But the significance of the game went beyond the scoreline. It was the beginning of a new chapter in their storied rivalry. 1995. World Cup, a historic clash. Perhaps the most famous encounter between the two came in 1995. In front of a packed crowd at Ellis Park, Johannesburg, the Springboks and the All Blacks met in the final of the Rugby World Cup. The match was a grueling contest of physicality and endurance, with neither side giving an inch. South Africa, playing for national unity in the post-apartheid era, triumphed 15-12 in extra time, with Joel Stransky kicking the winning drop goal. Nelson Mandela, wearing a Springbok jersey, handed the trophy to South Africa's captain, Francois Pienaar, in one of the most iconic moments in sports history. 24. First century rivalry. Powerhouses collide. As the professional era of rugby took off, both teams continued to meet regularly in the Tri-Nations, which later became the Rugby Championship. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, the All Blacks were often the dominant side, frequently ranked as the world's #1 team. However, the Springboks always posed a threat, and their encounters remained fierce. In 2009, the Springboks swept the All Blacks in the Tri-Nations, proving they could still go toe-to-toe with the best. New Zealand responded with dominance in the following years, but every All Blacks Springboks match was seen as a heavyweight bout. 20 World Cup. The Boks returned to glory. The rivalry hit another peak at the 2019 Rugby World Cup. In the pool stages, the All Blacks beat the Springboks in a high-intensity clash, but it wasn't the end for South Africa. The Springboks went on to win the tournament, defeating England in the final. The win marked South Africa's return to the top of world rugby, and it reignited the rivalry between these two rugby giants. As we stand today, the rivalry between the All Blacks and the Springboks remains one of the most iconic in all of sports. Whether in New Zealand or South Africa, whenever these two teams meet, the stakes are sky high. They represent not just their countries, but the very spirit of rugby itself. Two nations forever locked in a battle of pride, skill, and history. With each new generation, the rivalry evolves, but the intensity never fades. Here's to the next century of epic battles between these titans of the rugby world.